And, by the way, there are protections under the law. It's the right of habeas corpus, where you do have a right to challenge your detention before the federal court through appeals with counsel, and that is certainly a protection that we respected in this country for a long time. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you. I would like to inform the body that I think Senator Levin's understanding and reasoning is incredibly sound. We've actually been talking about this for a couple of days. And in light of the Hamdi decision and just plain old common sense, I will support the Feinstein Amendment. And I'll be the first to say, if we're attacked by the Iranians tomorrow or some other group, we have an authorization to use force. Senator Levin and I'll be the first one to say, in that authorization, we will provide, if an American citizen joins the Iranians in a war against America, they can be detained under the law of war. And you can vote ever how you like. I know how I would vote. But this has already gone up to the Supreme Court. And Senator Levin, if I could kind of build on what you said as to the logic of the court, and I think the logic of our position, let's get us back to the United States. I don't think anybody in their right mind would say that the United States is not part of the battlefield in the war on terror. I would suggest that of all the places the enemy wants to hit us, is here at home the most. Their goal is to kill us here. They'll kill us in Libya. They'll kill us in Afghanistan. They'll attack our consulates. They'll kill our soldiers. They will blow up our embassies. They will hit us all over the world. But don't be misled that they want to hit us here. Remember 9/11? I do. I'm sure you all do. Well, you know what? The only reason we hadn't had another 9/11 is we've been fighting these bastards over there. We've been getting good intelligence. The people held at Guantanamo Bay, it took a couple of years before any of them told us what was going on, and we found about bin Laden not because we tortured people, because we put the intelligence puzzle together over time by holding people under the law of war and gathering good intelligence, and we got bin Laden. But you know what? Bin Laden's dead. The war's not over. I wish it were. Now, Senator Levin, the homeland. If you've got a planned attack on a Navy vessel or a military installation, I think the point you were making is that we already have authorized the use of force to protect the country against the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Is that right?
My opinion that is the fundamental core ruling in the Hamdi case. Now, Hamdi, we've got to be accurate, applied in the circumstances to citizens that were captured in Afghanistan. But the reasoning that they used led them to conclude that there was an explicit authorization to detain those citizens even though they're American citizens. And their argument was that detention, capture and detention, is an inherent, in their words, is so fundamental to capture and detain, is such an accepted an incident to war as to be an exercise of the necessary and appropriate force which Congress authorized the President to use. And so, in my analogy, if a boatload full of al-Qaeda, including an American citizen, comes to a Navy base and attacks that base and is captured by those sailors, that is surely an incident of war, and I believe the capture and detention of those al-Qaeda terrorists would be the exercise of necessary and appropriate force which we authorize the President to use in the authorization for military force. That's
on that, just to make sure that we understand about a potential attack on a Navy base here at home. No one is suggesting that the military could not use force against an al-Qaeda attack here at home. The Hamdi case was an American citizen captured in Afghanistan. I hope we're not trying to create a picture that somehow America is a place where our own military cannot fire a shot in defense of their ships or our country. So we have in Virginia, let's say, we got some ships up there, and you got a boatload of al-Qaeda types trying to ram the ship. You agree with me that our military can use force to defend us here at home against al-Qaeda. Is that right? So, if our military is authorized to use force, they don't have to call the FBI or the Virginia State Police to shoot. They can shoot themselves against an enemy coming at them in America.
Coming into America, attacking us?
Absolutely.
At a Navy base or at a...
Right. Because we're not fighting a crime. We don't have to go disarm our military and call the local cops, would you please shoot these people before they get here? No, our guys are going to shoot you. If you're an American citizen asked to get in a boat to attack an American ship or a military installation in the United States, we're going to shoot you. And if we wound you, we're going to capture you. And then here's what we're going to do to you, incident of using force. The Supreme Court has said that when you authorize to use force, it makes no sense to give that authorization if you don't have the power to detain. Because the worst thing you can do to the American military is make them to kill everybody and capture no one, or let the other guy, let them go. So kill them all is not good policy, and it's a bad spot to put your military in, and the option shouldn't be kill them all or let them all go. The option should be kill where you have to, and if you can capture, do so. Do you agree with that?
I do.
And our military can fire the shots to use force to defend the homeland and defend themselves here at home. And the Supreme Court says once you authorize the ability to use force, it just follows as night follows day. Detention is part of the ability to use force. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if it's not, you've turned our military into murderers. Because you're not supposed to shoot somebody who's wounded in the water, and you shouldn't watch them swim away. You should capture them and should interrogate them under the law of war. Isn't that what Hamdi is trying, the point they're trying to make?
It is, and it is part of that point cites the Kieran case, which says citizenship in the United States of an enemy belligerent does not relieve him from the consequences of a belligerency which is unlawful because in violation of the law of war. Here's the key words. Citizens who associate themselves with the military arm of an enemy government and with its aid, guidance, and direction enter this country bent on hostile acts are enemy belligerents within the meaning of the Hague Convention.
Can I read another quote from Hamdi? There is no bar to this nation's holding one of its own citizens as an enemy combatant. Hamdi's detention could last for the rest of his life because the law of war detention can last for the duration of the relevant conflict. Here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a system consistent with the Hamdi decision, and quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm trying to avoid is the criminal paradigm, because I know the difference between criminal law and law of war. Under the law of war, you can detain somebody for interrogation to find out what the enemy's up to if you believe that person to be part of the enemy. And let me tell my friends, I do not want to take our criminal justice system and bastardize it. During the Bush years and the military commission rollout, they had a provision that in a military commission trial, the military jury could be given classified information not shared with the defendant. I said no. If a trial means anything, it means the right to confront those witnesses against you. I jealously guard that the worst al-Qaeda member in the world, when they go on trial in military commissions, will have a lawyer, the right to appeal to our Supreme Court, and will be able to confront every witness against them. An American citizen who joins al-Qaeda or the Taliban will be tried in federal court because we took military commissions off the table. That's the trial. Here's the question. If you're allowing our military to use force to protect themselves and us, as Hamdi says, it naturally follows with the use of force comes the lawful detention. And that is why I will be voting for Feinstein. I think that's where most Americans are. And if there's any confusion, we can talk about this in conference. But Senator Levin, I just want to thank you for since 2006, working with me and against me. You know, our dispute went to the Supreme Court about what would be an adequate substitute for habeas, and you won, 5-4. And damn those judges, but that's the way it goes. And you know what? There were some Republicans and Democrats who disagreed with me and you both, but I respect an independent judiciary, and I know Justice Roberts kind of got some people mad at him because of the Obamacare decision. But you know, that's the way it goes. That's the way these old judges are. I just really appreciate an independent judiciary. And after that decision in 2006 or 7, I just want to say how much of a pleasure it's been to work with you and others to try to find a way to achieve a balance in a war that's hard to understand. There is no capital to conquer. There is no airplanes to shoot down in terms of their jet fighters. There's no Navy to sink, but they use boats to attack us. They use private planes to kill us. At the end of the day, we're in a war. The outcome does matter, and I want to win this war. I know everybody in this body wants to win this war. I want to live within our values. I work with you and Senator McCain to say, even though we're fighting the worst people on the planet, count me out when it comes to waterboarding. People on my side, I remember and I understand them very well. Why do you care about what we do to these people? They'll cut our heads off because we're Americans. It's not necessary to win the war to go down that road. And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, the opposite is true. You can't win this war if you don't realize you're in a war. We're not fighting common crime. We're fighting a vicious enemy, and we can do it within our values. We can do it in due process, consistent with the law of war, and when we get in that criminal arena, consistent with criminal law. And as much as I disagree with this president, I will not deny him the ability that every commander-in-chief's had for decades as an option if he chooses to use it. And if you want to go down the criminal road, you can, but we need the option. As much as I dislike President Obama, I'm not going to use as a reason to change the law of war is because Barack Obama may put some people in jail that disagree with him, and I'm not going to buy into some of the rhetoric coming out of our side. A habeas corpus independent judiciary review means nothing if Obama appointed the judge. We're better than that. I stand ready to vote for Feinstein. I stand ready to work with my colleagues to continue to find a way to fight and win a war within our values, the outcome which will matter not only to us, but those who follow. God bless every person on the front line who's risking their lives at home and abroad. And here's what you have as a promise between Senator Levin and myself and many others. We're going to give you the tools to keep us safe and to keep your comrades safe. We're not going to do things in this war that make no sense in other wars. You need our help, you need our prayers, and you need the tools to fight and win this war, and we will give you those tools.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I want to congratulate my colleagues on, even though they appear to sometimes have disdain for the trial by jury, to appear to be supporting the right to trial by jury, and I congratulate them on their conversion. I think they're still a little bit confused on Hamdi. Hamdi had to do with the citizen fighting overseas and nothing to do with the citizen here. I have great confidence that the Supreme Court, given a ruling on the right to trial by jury, will affirm the right to trial by jury, whether they were appointed by Ronald Reagan or President Obama. So we'll have that fight on another day. I will say, though, that our oath of office says that we will defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. I met with cadets this week, and they asked me about what is the freedom we fight for. The freedom we fight for is the Bill of Rights, is the Constitution. If we have careless disregard for the Constitution, what are we fighting for? I will tell you, since I know this record of this debate will be widely read, that I want to make formal objection to the crazy bastard standard. I don't really think that if we're going to have a crazy bastard standard that we shouldn't have a right to trial by jury. Because if we're going to lock up all the crazy bastards, for goodness sakes, would you not want, if you're a crazy bastard, to have a right to trial by jury? I think this is a very serious debate and should not be made frivolous. This is an ancient right that we have defended for 800 years, for goodness sakes. To say that habeas is due process is absurd. It's the beginning of due process. If you don't have a right to trial by jury, you do not have due process. You do not have a Constitution. What are you fighting against and for if you throw the Constitution out, if you throw the Sixth Amendment out? It's in the body of our Constitution. It's in the Bill of Rights. It's in every Constitution in the United States. For goodness sakes, the trial by jury has been a long-standing and ancient and noble right. For goodness sakes, let's not scrap it now. I will accept victory today. I hope we will win victory and reaffirm the right to trial by jury. But let's don't play any games with any aspect and really believe that any Supreme Court in the United States, whether appointed by a Republican or a Democrat, is going to say that an American citizen does not have a right to trial by jury. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President. Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Gary Mayo, an Army Fellow in Senator Hutchinson's office, be granted floor privileges during the consideration of 3254.
Without objection. Senator from California.
Would you tell me, please, what the respective times for either side on this amendment is?
The opposition time has expired. The proponents have 6 minutes remaining.
I will.
We went all
Senator from Michigan.
significantly over our time, I believe, and we will.
I believe we are,
happy
too.
to accommodate Senator Feinstein or others.
No, I just wanted to thank everybody. I think we had a good debate. I think we ended in a good place. I'm very hopeful that the body will pass this now by a large majority. I think there is some disagreement on the interpretation of Hamdi, but I think this is a good discussion to have. And I think these cases are very important. They're a whole series of cases. And so I just hope that we are successful tonight in achieving something that really hasn't been achieved for decades. So I want to thank everybody, our co-sponsors. I want to thank the chairman of the committee, and in particular, Senator Graham, who said what he said in a very spicy way. I didn't quite know where that was going to come out, but it came out just fine. So thank you, Mr. President, and I hope we can vote.
Senator from Alabama.
Well, it was a good debate, Senator Feinstein. You're always gracious and alert and smart in your arguments. I want to say one thing that is not in doubt. And some of my colleagues, I think Senator Paul and others have suggested that somehow the law of the United States has been changed in recent years, and we need the Feinstein Amendment to fix it and restore the constitutional rights we're all entitled to. What I want to say, without any doubt and I think any fear of real contradiction, is this amendment alters the history of the United States, alters a long-term understanding of the rules of war, places American citizens in a position where they cannot be treated effectively as an enemy of the state and detained and actually be in a position to be released to continue their war against the United States. I think that's the bad policy. So I agree with Senator Levin and Ayad and others who share that view. I'm not quite I'm not quite able to understand, I'm not sure Senator Feinstein does, that this therefore establishes through understandings of Hamdi and Supreme Court decision that therefore you can vote for it. I don't think it's the right step. I don't really think we should alter the historical position of the United States that those who are at war with the United States are not treated as criminals. Southerners who captured by Lincoln weren't released. When Washington dealt with the Whiskey Rebellion, he sent out Alexander Hamilton. They weren't given Miranda rights. They went out there to stop the rebellion. They were citizens. So I would just say that that's what I feel about that. Mr. President, I'd like to call up, set aside the pending business and call up amendment number 3009. Is that correct?
Is there objection? Senator from Michigan.
Repeat the request.
I would like to set aside the pending amendment and call up amendment number 3009. I understand it would not be voted on tonight, but I just thought I'd like to get it pending.
I wonder if the senator would speak on it without calling.
And perhaps even speak on it tonight so you can vote.
Without calling it up. I wonder if the senator would speak to the amendment without calling up the amendment.
I would be glad to if the chairman thinks that there won't be a problem of calling it up at a later date.
I hope
Would he
not.
support me in that?
I hope not. I don't even know what's in the amendment, but we're trying to accommodate a process where everybody's going to have a chance, hopefully, to call up their amendments. But we've got to do it in order where we know what's in the amendment. We've got to have our staffs have an opportunity to make sure we understand what's in the amendment. We're working on this amendment. So I have no objection whatever to your talking about the amendment. We are working hard on the amendment.
Working to get it in order.
To get it in order, okay?
All right. Well, this has been conveyed to your staff.
We are working on it, but if you could just not call it up or seek to call it up at this time, but speak to it, we would appreciate it.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I would withdraw the offer of calling up that amendment and my request to set aside the pending amendment. But I would share some thoughts about it. I think my voice will hold up. It deals with the ability of the Congress of the United States to review any bilateral security agreement with Afghanistan. Congress was not consulted regarding the framework or the substance of the enduring strategic partnership agreement between the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. That was signed on May 1st, 2012. The agreement commits the United States to establishing a long-term bilateral security agreement with Afghanistan. In the past, Congress has been consulted and sometimes provided advice and consent to the ratification of these type of agreements. The Strategic Partnership Agreement, already signed by President Obama, is a legally binding agreement that committed the United States to various policies, including those related to the drawdown of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. It's broad, it's vague, and any further agreements entered into by the President that are based upon it should be reviewed by the appropriate congressional committees. The President and Secretary of Defense have stated that the United States continues to fight in Afghanistan to defeat al-Qaeda, while the authorization of military force authorizes the President to use any means necessary to prevent any acts of terrorism against the United States. His authority to enter into bilateral security agreements with Afghanistan should be looked at and reviewed at least by the Congress. The bilateral security agreement will supersede not only the strategic partnership agreement, so this will be the bilateral security agreement, but additional memorandum of understanding related to special operations in Afghanistan and detainee transfers will be part of this agreement. The issues addressed in the forthcoming bilateral security agreement are too important not to require at least congressional review. The amendment would require the President to submit any proposed bilateral security agreement to the appropriate congressional committees 30 days before entering into the agreement. And this is not unreasonable, and Congress is exercising its role of oversight before the President makes long-term commitments that have significant ramifications from the size of forces that we commit to the legal authority of our commanders. So this will be a final agreement that will impact quite significantly the commitment financially, militarily, and in blood and human support of our members. There's a history behind these kind of SOFAs, these agreements. The Senate approved the NATO Status of Forces Agreement. We actually voted on it and approved it in advance. A treaty, a formal treaty, was used as an underlying source of authority for a Status of Forces Agreement on 7 different occasions: Australia, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, and Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. Congress has approved Status of Forces Agreements 3 additional times. Congress actually voted and approved them: the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. Now, Senator Webb, I think he might be able to come over tonight, really raised his concerns about this. Senator Webb expressed concern in Armed Services Committee that the Afghanis and the Iraqis' Parliament vote on the Status of Forces Agreement, but our Congress is not voting on the Status of Forces Agreement. Of course, Senator Webb is the co-sponsor of this amendment. And just to have that agreement, its full and complete agreement that commits the United States to be fully reported to the Congress of the United States, I don't think is too much to ask. And so right now we don't have any indication that that would happen, and there's some opposition to it. But why would that be a problem? Why would the administration not want Congress to know what our commitments are and what we would be expected to support? So I believe it's a good amendment. Hopefully we can get it moved forward, maybe accepted, but if not, by vote. And I just would say I think we can handle it. I don't think it should cause the objections that some see in it. This does not require that the amendment, that the Congress have a right to vote to reject the amendment or approve the amendment. It simply says the agreement that's entered into, the SOFA, has to be produced promptly to the Congress. I think that's a reasonable position, and I would ask my colleagues to support it. I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I take this time to explain an amendment that I hope I will be able to call up shortly, amendment number 3625. I take this time to explain that amendment at this point, knowing full well that our schedule might get difficult when these amendments are brought up at a later point. My amendment would strike Section 341 of the FY 2013 National Defense Authorization Act. It included language that would arbitrarily require the Secretary of Defense to cut the civilian and contractor workforce to achieve equal savings as they achieve from the planned reductions in the military personnel for FY 12 through 17. This provision does not consider the work requirements of the Department nor the law that states, and this is what the law says, that civilian personnel of the Department of Defense shall be managed fiscal year solely on the basis of and consistent with the workload required to carry out the functions and activities of the Department. What that means is that when we consider the number of civilian personnel needed by the Department of Defense, we look at the mission that they need to accomplish, and we look at the budget support. That's how those decisions have been made. My amendment would strike the Section 341 that's in the committee draft and reaffirm that the civilian manpower requirements by stating the following: the Secretary of Defense, consistent with the long-standing law, which was expanded in a bipartisan effort in the FY12 NDAA bill, ensure that the civilian workforce is sufficiently sized, a term copied from 10 U.S.C. 129A, after taking into account military strategy requirements and military end strength. The Comptroller General is required to report back to the Congress whether the Department is in compliance with the law. I'm pleased that this amendment is co-sponsored by Senator Akaka, Boxer, Begich, Brown of Ohio, Durbin, Harkin, Leahy, Mikulski, McCaskill, and Tester. I might point out that there is no such provision included in the House NDAA bill. I would like to note what this amendment does not do. It would not prevent the Department of Defense from downsizing the civilian workforce. Indeed, according to the House Armed Services Committee, the Department is already reducing its civilian workforce by over 10,000 positions in FY12 alone. It would not treat service contractors any different than civilian employees. The goal of this amendment is pretty simple. It would reaffirm the law that prohibits DOD from managing its civilian workforce by arbitrary constraints. That's what this provision that I am asking to be stricken by my amendment would do. It would set caps and cuts. Downsizing it is inevitable, but consistent with the law. It should be based on the workload analysis and the budgets that are provided through the congressional process. This would repudiate the holy notion that what happens in one department's workforce automatically affects the other. The way that the language came out from the committee, regardless of the needs of our civilian missions within the Department of Defense, its cut would be tied to the military side, and the contractors would also be affected. It should be based upon their mission. It should be based upon their budget. There shouldn't be arbitrary provisions. Proponents of Section 341 would insist that civilian workforce should automatically be reduced by approximately 5% because the Obama administration would reduce the military workforce by approximately 5%. Well, they're different missions, different priorities, and they need to be judged based upon their respected priorities and missions. Earlier today, the administration released a statement of administration policy that clearly rejects the current Section 341 in the bill. I'm quoting from the administration's statement of policy. The administration objects to Section 341, which would reduce funding for the civilian and contractor workforce by a rate that is at least equal to the percentage of funding saved from the planned reductions in military personnel and strength. This would require savings in civilian and service contract workforces in excess of $5 billion over the planned savings through FY17. The administration believes the size of the civilian workforce should be determined based on workload and funding, not on arbitrary comparisons to the military. To comply with this legislation, the Department would need to significantly divest workload and impose workforce caps. Mr. President, what the committee did, I don't know if it was intentional or not, what the committee did, they imposed their own sequestration order on the civilian and contractor workforce within DOD. That makes no sense whatsoever. Everyone here has been outspoken about that it's wrong to do these across-the-board cuts that have nothing to do with priority or mission. Well, my amendment would strike that provision from the committee bill. It would substitute instead law that requires that the workforce be determined by mission and budget. It does not prevent at all from us downsizing. We all know we've got to downsize, and the budget downsizes the civilian and contractor workforce. But we shouldn't be setting arbitrary caps within what we've already done through the review and budget process. I'm pleased that this amendment is supported by many of the groups that are directly impacted by the decisions here. When I have a chance to follow this amendment, I would urge my colleagues to support the amendment so that we can correct this provision in the bill, which I think allows us to comply with current law, protect the mission of the Department of Defense, and establish priorities in a way that we should, not by arbitrary caps. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I've been attempting to contact the primary author of the Amendment 3199, Senator Durbin. Let me, first of all, ask unanimous consent that I be added, if I'm not already, as an original co-sponsor to the Amendment 3199.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I think it's interesting that this amendment is coming up at this time, because it was just a matter of a couple of hours ago we passed an amendment on this floor extending our effort and our policy against the LRA, Lord's Resistance Army, and that's Joseph Kony is the individual who is, for now over 20 years, has been abducting young people, training them, taking them up, and forcing them to go out and fight with the LRA. And if they didn't do it, they'd have to go home and murder their own family, and it's just been a horrible thing. Well, we're making great progress now, and I've spent a lot of times, primarily in Uganda, where this all began. And it looks like now we are getting closer to that. And the reason I'm interested in the amendment 3199 by Senator Durbin and am supporting it is because a very similar thing is going on right now. I happen to have spent some time in the eastern part of the Congo, where I've seen the rise of another individual, is Colonel Makenga. Colonel Makenga is very much like Joseph Kony. In fact, he is training the young people, young kids, to be fighters, and they're going out, and we all know about the effort out there with what they call the rebel leader of M23. Well, that's very similar to what's happening up in Uganda. In fact, the Uganda effort and the LRA effort was very prominent, actually, in eastern Congo, the same place where this, and I have suspected myself that there's a relationship between the two efforts, so I strongly support that. I want to say one thing, though, that I have strong feelings about. I want to make sure to get on the record, and I'd like to have my comments placed in the record at the time that this amendment comes up for consideration. And that is, a lot of people were feeling that one of the problems with the M23 leaders came from Rwanda itself, and even at some time had talked about President Kagame, President Paul Kagame, as if there's a relationship between this butcher over there, the Colonel Makenga, and President Kagame. There is no relationship whatsoever. In fact, President Kagame rejects what this rebel leader is trying to do. I had occasion to spend some time with Louise Mushikiwabo, who is the Foreign Affairs Minister from the Republic of Rwanda. And I was with her, I have her picture right here. I was with her just recently, and she gave us the assurance that the President Paul Kagame, is just as adamant about doing away with this rebel leader, the Colonel Makenga of the M22 rebel movement. So I'm very happy to join in with this, and I want to make sure that I have my assurance in this, that there is no relationship between this rebel movement and the President of Rwanda. With that, I'll yield the floor. I see the author of this amendment is on the floor.
Mr. President.
From Illinois.
Mr. President, I'm going to thank my colleague from Oklahoma. Many of my other colleagues may not be aware of his intense personal interest and dedication to the continent of Africa. He has traveled there probably as much, if not more, than any other member of the United States Senate. It has been a great opportunity, experience, and education for me to travel there over the years, but my few visits don't come close to the commitment that's been made by the Senator from Oklahoma, and I greatly respect his knowledge of the area and appreciate his co-sponsorship of the amendment, which is pending, which we hope will be cleared. I've been to eastern Congo twice, 2005 and 2010, Goma. Goma is one of those places you'll never forget once you visit it. This is one of the poorest places on earth. You see the poverty in every direction. You see the disease. You see the victims of war in every direction because there's been an ongoing war in this part of the world which literally rivals some of the great wars of our history in terms of the innocent people who have been killed, maimed, raped, and have suffered displacement. And on top of all of these things, in Goma is an active volcano which erupted not that many years ago, covering this poor, godforsaken part of the world with lava. And it troubles me to go there and see the suffering that goes on every day and the ongoing war that is taking place. The rebel groups, M23, have now taken over sections of eastern Congo. Eastern Congo is known as the rape capital of the world. One of the tactics of war is to rape the women of any age in front of their families and then force these women many times to kill other members of the family who've witnessed it. They estimate that regional war and rape leaves an estimated 1,000 or more women assaulted every day in the Congo. 12% of all Congolese women have been victimized by this. I met some of them at a hospital called Heal Africa. A population of 8 million people, Heal Africa is the only hospital in the area that offers antiretroviral drugs for children with HIV and surgery to repair the bodies of these traumatized women. Their co-founder, Heal Africa's co-founder, Lynn Lucy, passed away this past March. What a saint she was. And while her death was a terrible loss for Goma, Heal Africa and other health workers and organizations continue to carry on her vision, including many American medical students who come there to volunteer. God bless them. There was a delegation from Purdue University when I visited, and many others have followed. The Rwandan genocide has been the root cause of many of the problems, as well as a weak government in Congo. Eastern Congo is virtually on its own, with very little governance or protection, and criminals run rampant. Dr. Denis Mukwege runs another hospital in Bukavu, the capital of the South Kivu province. Panzi Hospital, a one-story building on a tree-lined dirt road, 10 new rape cases every single day. And that's just those survivors who seek treatment. The victims range in age from 2 years of age to 80 years of age. The doctor says they arrive broken, waiting for death, hiding their faces. Last month, armed gunmen attacked this genuine hero at his home, murdering his guard and shooting at him, likely because of a strong speech he gave at the United Nations last month, denouncing mass rape and impunity in Congo. Mr. President, the United Nations has 20,000-member peacekeeping force in eastern Congo to help the region's violence. The area is still very fragile, awash in weapons, warlords, and competing regional interests. But it's also rich in valuable minerals that are found in our everyday electronics and cell phones. It's been said the Congo War contains wars within wars. That's true. But fueling much of this violence is a bloody contest for control of these minerals. In the last Congress, I was proud to join in a bipartisan effort with Senators Brownback, Feingold, Dodd, Johnson, and others to try to prevent the country's mineral wealth from fueling the region's horrific violence. The bill we passed asked for transparency from major companies using these minerals, and it has to be approved. I was happy to see in August that the Securities and Exchange Commission approved the rule. It's a sound and fair rule. I was disappointed when the National Association of Manufacturers in the United States say they've already targeted this rule for a legal challenge. It's a modest provision for disclosure, just to try to stop the death that is coming from the trade in these minerals. I appeal to the conscience of the CEOs of these companies in America that do their part to help end this violence that's going on in Congo. Please stop fighting this simple provision so that we can trace these minerals and stop the exploitation of these poor people. Last week, a well-armed group of rebels calling itself M23 overran and occupied Goma. These rebels have threatened to continue their incursion and set course for Kinshasa, Congo's capital in the west. They've created a new wave of fleeing refugees in need of clean water, food, and shelter. This move was condemned by the UN Security Council, which expressed deep concerns about M23. These rebels are known for brutal violence. This is an indication of a little baby being passed by a truck, hopefully to safety, a victim of the violence that's going on with the M23 rebels who have taken over this part of the Congo. Some of you may have seen that tragic photo in Monday's New York Times. This baby is being hoisted into a packed truck as families try to get out. Even more troubling, there's considerable evidence these rebels have and are continue to receive strategic and material support from neighboring Rwanda, just as Senator Inhofe mentioned on the floor, and potentially from Uganda as well. News reports indicate that the M23 rebels have access to night vision goggles and other equipment they never had before, indicative of significant assistance from the well-supplied Rwandan army. We've seen reports that the Rwandan army crossed the border working side by side with these rebels. A Congolese regional governor, Julian Paluku, stated that the Rwandan army entered his province behind the M23 rebels and forced the Congolese military to flee. Human Rights Watch has corroborated these reports and has independently confirmed the Rwandan government's role. Mr. President, there was some hope that the leaders of Congo and Rwanda and Uganda would meet last week to find a way to end this violence. Yet it didn't occur. It appears Rwandan President Kagame did not attend as he had once promised. Now, Rwanda is a friend of the United States. I have visited President Kagame, and I've been to Rwanda. It's certainly been through its share of suffering in the genocide of 1994, and it helped in peacekeeping efforts in Sudan. With that kind of leadership, though, comes important responsibility. No one in Rwanda or any country will benefit from a collapsed Congo in which the rebels hold large swaths of territory and these impoverished people at gunpoint. I urge Rwanda to rein in the M23 rebels and work with its regional neighbors to bring stability to eastern Congo. To make sure this happens, Senators Bozeman, Boxer, Coons, let me get the entire list because I'm proud that they've joined me in this effort, Brown of Ohio, Cardin, and now Senator Inhofe have joined me in filing an amendment to this defense authorization bill that would impose an asset freeze and visa ban on any outside parties that are providing support to the M23 rebels, an amendment I urge my friends, Senators Levin and McCain, to accept. I hope such sanctions won't be needed and that wiser heads prevail. The people of eastern Congo have suffered long enough. Now, I know that Senator Levin is working for the approval of this amendment. I sincerely hope that it can be done before the end of the evening. I'm going to, at this point, yield the floor in the hopes that we can bring this to a positive conclusion.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Oklahoma.
Let me compliment the Senator on his concern for this activity that's going on there. I would like to clarify, though, for the record, because I have had personal conversations with the President, with many members of the staff, and good friends over there. Africa is a little bit different than other areas. Sometimes there can be rebel groups within a country that are doing something that people attribute to a country. In this case, that isn't true with Rwanda. In the case of Rwanda, if they say that some of the Rwanda military was supporting the M23 movement, that would not be with the authority or the knowledge even of President Kagame himself and his administration. I just want to make sure to clarify that. And then also to mention the area of Goma that the Senator from Illinois is talking about is something that a lot of people they don't understand what that is. Goma is in the far eastern part of Congo. The capital is Kinshasa. It is further from Kinshasa to Goma than it is, of course, all the way across this country twice. So you're talking about an area where there is really not much control. It happens that the person is Robert Rubera, parliamentarian Rubera, is the one who's responsible for that area. But in the way it's worked in there, they really don't have any control over there. This is a rebel movement. The reason I say that I believe, and I've always believed, that there is a relationship between the LRA and the M23 is because I was over there when the LRA had just left. We were hoping to be there at the same time, a matter of a couple of days before. They went north up through the Central African Republic and up through actually South Sudan over to Uganda where they originally started. That's the same area and the same motive, the same way of operating as M23. They're abducting the little kids. People don't realize this. They'll abduct little kids, teach them how to use weapons, and make them go back to their villages, murder their parents, murder their siblings, and if they don't do that, they cut their noses off, their ears off. We've got pictures. We've seen this happen. So this is, I think there's a relationship here, and I think that, and I'm pleased that we have adopted as a policy of this country to intervene. Let's keep in mind, we have a war against terrorism. This is terrorism. And as this is spreaded throughout the, well, starting actually more in the Horn of Africa, Djibouti, and then moving down into the continent, this is the type of terrorism that comes from this. So I consider this as a part of that war. But I do want to emphasize that the accusation that Rwanda and their leadership, and specifically Paul Kagame, the president. Let's remember what happened with Paul Kagame. He was the one back during the genocide of 1994 was able to come in and pull everybody together. A lot of the rebels went to the west out of Rwanda and went into the eastern part of Congo. We know that's right, but they've been rejected by this, and there's no accusation that there's even a relationship there. But I would just hope that people realize that we do have some really great presidents throughout the continent of Africa. That is one of them. It's a difficult situation there. It's one that we need to have our attention. And by the way, I would say that I don't believe that has been cleared on our side. It would be with me, but it hasn't happened yet, and we'll hope to work in that direction so we can take this up. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the filing deadline for first-degree amendments to S. 3254, the Department of Defense Authorization Bill, be set at 9:45 today.
Is there objection? Without objection, it is so ordered.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I understand that amendment number 3199, the Senators Durbin and Inhofe has now been cleared on both sides. So I would ask unanimous consent that this amendment now be called up and considered.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
Senator from Illinois, Mr. Durbin, proposes an amendment number 3199. At the end of subtitle D of Title 12, add the following. Section 1246.
I ask unanimous consent that the further reading be dispensed.
Without objection.
I know of no further debate.
The question is on the amendment. Is there further debate? If not, will all in favor say aye?
Aye.
Any opposed say nay? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is adopted.
I move to reconsider. Mr. President, let me thank Senators Durbin and Inhofe for again focusing on a really critical issue. And I know Africa seems far away and some of these events seem far away, but they've tried to bring them home to us, and hopefully we will be listening, all of us, to what they have accomplished and what we've done here tonight. I hope the American people realize the importance of this issue and that the message will be clear to those who are violating civil rights so horrendously. And I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Without objection, so ordered. Under the previous order, the questions on amendment number 3254, offered by the senator from New Hampshire. Amendment 3245, excuse me. Senator from New Hampshire.
Nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, I have you. Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Cochran, Cornyn, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Lee, McConnell, Sessions, and Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Brown of Ohio, Cardin, Conrad, Durbin, Franken, Harkin, Cole, Levin, Merkley, Murray, Reed of Nevada, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, and Whitehouse. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? No. Mr. Lugar? Mr. Lugar? Aye. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Chambliss? Mr. Chambliss? Aye.
Nobody junior.
Ms. Klobuchar? No.
Nobody. I'm talking about on the public side. No, nobody junior.
Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy? No. Mr. Coburn? Mr. Coburn? Aye. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Enzi? Mr. Enzi? Aye.
No.
Mr.
You can tell me. You just can't be.
Mr. Webb? Mr. Webb? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski? No. Ms. Collins? Aye. Carey. Mr. Carey? No. Ms. Snow? Ms. Snow? Aye.
But you can only do it if there's no one else.
Mr. Kyle? Mr. Kyle? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. McCain? Mr. McCain? Aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran? Aye.
I'm sure he's thought about it.
I know he's thought.
Bob Casey, what do you want?
Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? No. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of Colorado? No. Ms. Ayotte? Ms. Ayotte? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Coates? Mr. Coates? Aye. Mr. Bennett? Mr. Bennett? No. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? Aye. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Begich? Mr. Begich? No. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Thune. Yes. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Akaka, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, no. Mrs. Hutchison, Aye. Ms. Landrieu. Aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Is that an aye? Is it no? Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Lautenberg, no.
What's funny about this
Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. No. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman. No. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman. Aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer. No. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell. No.